I still remember the way the light looked that evening, how it painted everything the color of old blood. The sun was dying behind the fields that stretched beyond our small town, casting shadows that seemed longer than they had any right to be. I pulled my truck into the driveway the same way I had every evening for 23 years, the gravel crunching under tires that needed replacing. The hardware store had been busy that day, but I could barely recall a single customer's face. Everything felt distant, muffled, like I was watching my own life through dirty glass. The house stood before me, glowing with warm yellow light from every window. Elaine always turned on too many lights when evening came, as if brightness could chase away whatever shadows lived in the corners of our marriage. I sat in the truck for a moment longer than necessary, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, and felt that familiar weight settle over my chest. It wasn't sadness exactly, but something heavier, something that had been growing for years without a name. I could see her silhouette moving through the kitchen window, preparing dinner with the same careful precision she brought to everything. 26 years of marriage had taught us both the choreography of evening routines. She would have the table set by the time I walked through the door. We would eat quietly, discussing the weather or the store or our daughter Miriam's latest phone call from college. We would clean the dishes together, watch television, and go to bed in the same room where we had somehow learned to sleep like strangers. The mailbox stood at the end of our drive like a small monument to ordinary life. I walked toward it slowly, my work boots heavy on the pavement, and that's when I heard the low rumble of an engine behind me. I turned to see the sheriff's cruiser rolling to a stop at the edge of our property, its presence both familiar and somehow electric in the fading light. Malcolm Reeves stepped out of the car with the same unhurried confidence he carried everywhere. We had known each other since we were boys, though our paths had diverged in ways that seemed inevitable now. He was taller than I remembered being as children, his uniform crisp despite the long day, his presence filling the space around him in a way that made the air feel thinner. He called my name across the distance between us, and something in his voice made my heart begin to beat differently. Not faster, but deeper, like it was remembering a rhythm it had forgotten. "Nathan," he said, though most people called me Nathaniel. Only a few people had ever shortened my name, and hearing it from his lips felt like a small confession. I walked toward the cruiser, each step feeling both inevitable and impossible. He asked if we could talk privately, away from the open street, and I nodded, though I didn't understand why privacy mattered for whatever he needed to discuss. Malcolm opened the door and stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of his cologne mixed with the day's heat. Then he did something that stopped time completely. His hand reached out and touched my arm, just above the elbow, his fingers warm through the thin fabric of my work shirt. He told me to put my hand somewhere, to stay still for just a moment. The words didn't make complete sense, but I obeyed anyway, my palms finding the warm metal of the car door, my body responding to his voice in ways I couldn't begin to understand. We stood like that for what felt like hours, but must have been only seconds, his hand still resting on my arm, the last light of day painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. I felt something crack open inside my chest, something that had been sealed so tightly I had forgotten it existed. When he finally stepped back, I couldn't meet his eyes. I walked back to the house on unsteady legs, my hands shaking as I reached for the front door. Inside, Elaine had set the table exactly as I knew she would, the napkins folded into perfect triangles beside our plates. I picked up my napkin and tried to refold it, but my fingers wouldn't cooperate, trembling like leaves in a storm I couldn't see. She noticed, of course. 26 years of marriage had made her an expert in reading the small changes in my behavior. But she didn't ask questions, just watched me struggle with the simple task of arranging fabric while something enormous and unnamed hung in the air between us. The kitchen felt too bright, too warm, filled with the weight of everything I couldn't bring myself to say. Not yet. Hollow Creek is the kind of town where your reputation is built over decades, brick by careful brick, and where secrets move slower than Sunday gossip but last twice as long. Everyone knows everyone, or thinks they do, which amounts to the same thing in the end. I had lived here for 47 years, and in all that time, I had never given anyone reason to question who I was supposed to be. My life had been constructed with the precision of a well-built house. Every morning, I opened Carter Hardware at exactly 8 o'clock, the same store my father had left me when he passed 15 years ago. The bell above the door still chimed with the same tired song, and Mrs. Henderson still came in every Tuesday for the same box of wood screws she never seemed to use. I knew where every tool belonged, could find any part in the dark, could solve most problems with nothing but patience and the right equipment. The store was more than a business. It was proof of my place in the world, evidence that I was the kind of man people could depend on. When someone's water heater failed or their fence needed mending, they came to me. Not just for supplies, but for advice, for the quiet confidence that came with knowing how things worked and how to fix them when they broke. I was good at fixing things. Everything except the parts of my own life that seemed permanently damaged. Sundays meant church, of course. Elaine and I sat in the same pew we had claimed 26 years ago, third row from the front on the left side. I listened to Pastor Williams deliver sermons about love and forgiveness and the sanctity of marriage, and I nodded in all the right places while something cold and hollow expanded in my chest. The words washed over me like water over stone, leaving no trace behind. After church came Sunday dinner, and after dinner came the ritual of lawn maintenance that had become as sacred as any prayer. I would spend 2 hours every week pushing the mower in perfect parallel lines across our quarter-acre, trimming edges with mathematical precision, pulling weeds that dared to disturb the order I had imposed on our small patch of earth. The neighbors often complimented my yard, and I accepted their praise with the same quiet satisfaction I felt when someone thanked me for finding exactly the right bolt for their project. But underneath this carefully constructed routine, I lived with a growing sense of absence. My marriage to Elaine had settled into something that felt more like a business partnership than a romance. We shared meals and household responsibilities and polite conversation about weather and work. We attended social functions together, presented a united front to the world, celebrated anniversaries with dinner at the same restaurant we had visited for years. What we didn't share was intimacy. We slept in the same bed, but occupied different countries of loneliness. She would read her book while I watched television, and sometimes I would catch her looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Not sadness, exactly, but something like resignation. As if she had made peace with disappointments I was still afraid to acknowledge. Our daughter Miriam had left for college 3 years ago, and her absence had revealed the true dimensions of the silence that lived in our house. She called every Sunday evening, and I treasured those conversations even as they reminded me how much of her life now happened beyond the reach of my influence. She was studying journalism, planning to move to a city whose name I could barely pronounce, building a future that would take her further and further from Hollow Creek. I was proud of her ambition and terrified by what her leaving had shown me about the emptiness that remained. Sheriff Malcolm Reeves moved through our town like a man who understood the weight of authority without needing to display it. He had been elected sheriff 8 years ago, after the previous sheriff retired, and in that time he had earned a reputation for fairness and quiet competence. He was the kind of man people trusted instinctively, whose presence could calm a room or command attention without him having to raise his voice. Malcolm was my age, maybe a year or two older, though he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. His wife had died in a car accident 5 years ago, and since then he had lived alone in the White House on Maple Street that everyone still thought of as the Reeves place. People worried about him, brought him casseroles and invitations to dinner, but he maintained his solitude with the same gentle firmness he brought to everything else. Our paths crossed regularly in a town the size of Hollow Creek. He would stop by the hardware store when he needed supplies for small repairs around the station or his house. We served together on the town council, attending monthly meetings where we discussed budgets and ordinances and the small dramas that passed for politics in our corner of the world. Sometimes I would see him at the diner, always sitting alone at the counter, always polite to Marlene who waited on him like she waited on everyone, with efficient kindness. But it was the smaller moments that stayed with me, the brief encounters that seemed to stretch longer than time allowed. The way his eyes would hold mine when we shook hands at council meetings. The pause that would settle between us when we passed on the street, as if we were both waiting for something neither of us could name. The time he had placed his hand on my shoulder while asking about a delivery to the station, and how that touch had seemed to burn through my shirt long after he had walked away. I began to realize that Malcolm saw me in a way that felt both dangerous and necessary. Not the careful, constructed version of myself that I presented to the rest of the world, but something deeper, something I had spent decades learning to hide. When he looked at me, I felt exposed and alive in equal measure, as if he could see through the architecture of my ordinary life to whatever truth I had buried beneath it. The feeling was terrifying and exhilarating and completely impossible to ignore. I found myself thinking about him at odd moments throughout the day, remembering the sound of his voice or the way he moved through space with such quiet certainty. I told myself these thoughts were normal, the kind of admiration any man might feel for someone he respected. But late at night, alone in the bed I shared with my wife, I knew I was lying to myself about what I felt when Malcolm Reeves said my name. The evening Malcolm walked into my store changed everything, though I didn't understand that until much later. It was a Thursday in late September, and I was closing up the way I always did, checking the register, turning off the lights in the back office, making sure every tool was in its proper place. The bell above the door chimed, and I looked up expecting to see someone who had forgotten we closed at 6. But it was Malcolm, still in uniform, his hat tucked under his arm like he was visiting someone's home rather than a place of business. He moved through the aisles slowly, his fingertips trailing along the edges of shelves, but he wasn't looking for anything specific. I could tell by the way his eyes kept finding mine instead of focusing on the merchandise. He asked about my day, about how business had been, about whether the new shipment of power tools had arrived on schedule. Normal questions that felt anything but normal coming from him. There was something different in his voice, a careful quality that made each word seem deliberate. When he mentioned Elaine, asking how she was doing, if she was still volunteering at the library, I felt a strange tightness in my chest. I answered his questions while continuing to close up around him, my hands busy with familiar tasks while my mind tried to understand why this ordinary conversation felt so charged with meaning. Malcolm leaned against the counter, watching me work, and I became hyper-aware of every movement I made. The way I sorted receipts, the sound of keys jingling as I locked the cash drawer, the squeak of my shoes on the linoleum floor. Then he mentioned the town fair, and something in his voice shifted. The annual Hollow Creek Fall Festival was 3 weeks away, he said, and he was looking for someone to help with the sheriff's booth, just to keep an extra pair of hands around. He explained, though his explanation felt incomplete. The way he asked the question made it clear this wasn't about needing help. This was about something else entirely. I should have declined. I had no particular interest in spending a Saturday surrounded by carnival games and screaming children, making small talk with neighbors while manning a booth designed to improve community relations. Elaine and I had attended the fair every year for decades, walking through together in comfortable silence, buying funnel cake we didn't really want, watching other people's families enjoy themselves with an enthusiasm we had somehow lost. But when Malcolm asked, when his eyes held mine across the small distance between us, I heard myself agreeing before I had consciously decided to say yes. Something about the way he looked at me felt like a summons I couldn't refuse, as if saying no would be a kind of betrayal of something I didn't even understand yet. The fair arrived with all the chaos and color that marked the end of harvest season in our part of the world. The town square filled with booths selling everything from handmade quilts to kettle corn, while a small carnival had set up on the vacant lot behind the post office. Children ran between attractions with sticky hands and wild hair, their parents trailing behind with the patient exhaustion that comes with trying to supervise joy. I found Malcolm at the sheriff's booth, which consisted of a folding table covered with pamphlets about home security and a display of confiscated items that had been donated to show kids what not to bring to school. He looked different out of his usual environment, more relaxed somehow. though he still carried himself with that quiet authority that made people naturally defer to him. We worked side by side throughout the morning and afternoon, greeting families, answering questions about neighborhood watch programs, helping elderly residents fill out forms for security consultations. The work itself was simple, but I found myself paying attention to the way Malcolm interacted with people. He remembered children's names, asked about relatives, listened to complaints about barking dogs with the same serious attention he might give to reports of actual crimes. Between visitors, we talked quietly, our conversations layered with meanings I was only beginning to recognize. He asked about the store, about whether I ever thought about expanding or selling, about what I planned to do when I eventually retired. I found myself telling him things I had never said out loud before, admitting that I sometimes felt trapped by the weight of other people's expectations, that success had become a kind of prison I had built for myself. When evening began to settle over the fairgrounds, when the families with young children had gone home and the teenagers had claimed the remaining attractions, Malcolm suggested we take a walk. The crowd had thinned enough that we weren't needed at the booth, he said, and he wanted to check the perimeter of the festival area to make sure everything was secure. We walked past the edge of the carnival, beyond the reach of the colored lights and recorded music, into the fields that stretched behind the town square. The noise of the fair faded behind us, replaced by the sound of crickets and the rustle of dry corn stalks in the evening breeze. The sky had turned the deep purple of approaching night, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening expanse above us. Malcolm walked beside me in comfortable silence for several minutes before he spoke again. When he did, his words cut through the evening air with the precision of a blade finding its mark. He said I carried something I didn't speak of, didn't I? Not a question, exactly, but not quite a statement either. An observation delivered with the kind of certainty that comes from careful watching, from paying attention to details other people miss. I stopped walking, my feet suddenly rooted to the ground as if the earth itself had decided to hold me in place. The directness of his words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. For 47 years I had carried secrets I couldn't name, longings I couldn't acknowledge, truths I had buried so deep I had almost convinced myself they didn't exist. But Malcolm had seen them anyway. Somehow, in all our brief encounters and careful conversations, he had recognized the shape of what I was hiding. The realization was terrifying and liberating in equal measure, like stepping to the edge of a cliff and discovering you had always known how to fly. I didn't answer his question because I couldn't find words adequate to the magnitude of what he was asking. But I didn't need to answer. We both understood that silence could be its own form of confession, that some truths are too large for language. We stood there in the darkness, surrounded by the vast emptiness of the countryside, while something fundamental shifted between us. When we finally walked back toward the lights of the fair, toward the world of other people and ordinary concerns, I knew that everything had changed. Not just between Malcolm and me, but inside me, in places I had kept locked for so long I had forgotten they existed. Whatever happened next, I could never again pretend that I was simply the man everyone thought they knew. After that night at the fair, my carefully ordered world began to crack like ice under unexpected weight. The routines that had anchored my life for decades suddenly felt fragile, insubstantial, as if they might dissolve at any moment. I would catch myself standing in the middle of the hardware store, holding a wrench or a packet of screws, completely unable to remember what I had been doing moments before. The familiar rhythm of my days had been disrupted by something I couldn't name but could feel everywhere. Malcolm seemed to appear in my peripheral vision with increasing frequency, not following me, exactly, but present in ways that felt both coincidental and inevitable. I would see his cruiser parked outside the diner when I stopped for coffee in the morning, catch glimpses of him talking to Mrs. Patterson about her fence repairs while I was locking up the store, notice him standing near the church steps after Sunday service while everyone else hurried to their cars. Our conversations began to stretch longer, each encounter extending past the boundaries of polite small talk into territory that felt increasingly dangerous. He would stop by the store ostensibly to ask about ordering new locks for the station, but we would end up discussing books we had read, places we had dreamed of visiting, the weight of responsibilities we had inherited rather than chosen. These talks always happened when we were alone, always carried an undercurrent of careful evaluation, as if we were both testing the strength of ice before deciding whether to step forward. There was a quality to Malcolm's attention that I had never experienced before. He listened to me with an intensity that made every word feel significant, as if he were memorizing not just what I said, but how I said it. When I mentioned feeling trapped by expectations, he nodded with understanding that went beyond sympathy. When I talked about the store and the weight of carrying on my father's legacy, he asked questions that revealed he had been thinking about my situation long before our conversation began. The most unsettling part was how these interactions with Malcolm began to unlock memories I had spent decades trying to forget. Lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling while Elaine slept beside me, I found myself remembering moments from my teenage years that I had buried so completely I had convinced myself they never happened. I remembered the way I used to linger in the locker room after basketball practice, pretending to organize my gear while really watching the other boys dress and undress with a fascination that had nothing to do with athletics. I remembered the electric feeling in my stomach when Tommy Morrison had grabbed my hand to help me up after I fell during a game, how that brief contact had seemed to burn through my skin and leave marks no one else could see. There had been a night during my senior year when David Wells and I had been studying for a history exam in his basement, and he had fallen asleep on the couch beside me. I had spent an hour watching him breathe, fighting the urge to touch his hair, to trace the line of his jaw with my fingertips. When he stirred and caught me staring, I had made some excuse about being tired and gone home, but I had carried the weight of that moment for weeks afterward. These weren't isolated incidents, I realized now. They were part of a pattern I had refused to acknowledge, a thread running through my adolescence that I had deliberately chosen not to follow. At 18, faced with the choice between exploring these feelings and conforming to what was expected of me, I had chosen safety. I had chosen Elaine, chosen the path that would make my parents proud, chosen the life that would earn approval from everyone who mattered in Hollow Creek. But now, nearly 30 years later, Malcolm's presence was making it impossible to maintain the careful distance I had created from my own truth. The way he looked at me, the deliberate casualness of his touches, the space he created for honesty in our conversations, all of it was awakening something that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. Malcolm never pushed for more than I was ready to give, but he was masterful at creating opportunities for intimacy that felt natural, inevitable. He would suggest late-night drives to check on reported disturbances in remote parts of the county, always asking if I wanted to ride along since I knew the area so well. We would drive the empty roads while he talked about his job, about the weight of being responsible for other people's safety, about the loneliness of making decisions that affected the entire community. During these drives, his hand would sometimes rest on the seat between us, close enough that I could feel its warmth without quite touching. When he needed to reach across me to adjust the radio or retrieve something from the glove compartment, his arm would brush against mine with a pressure that felt intentional, meaningful. These moments of contact were brief but electric, leaving me hyper-aware of my own skin, my own breathing, my own desperate need for more. There was an evening when we had stopped to investigate a report of teenagers drinking near the old quarry, and Malcolm had placed his hand on my shoulder while pointing out tire tracks in the mud. His palm was warm and steady against my shirt, and when he spoke, his voice was low enough that I had to lean closer to hear him. For a moment we stood like that, his hand anchoring me to the spot, while something unnamed passed between us in the darkness. These encounters left me feeling unmoored, as if the ground beneath my feet had become unreliable. I would return home from these drives or meetings with my heart racing and my thoughts in chaos, unable to concentrate on the simple domestic routines that had once provided comfort. Elaine would ask about my evening, and I would give her carefully edited versions of the truth, describing Malcolm's work concerns while omitting every detail that mattered. At home, the changes in me became impossible to hide completely. Elaine began to notice my distraction, the way I would lose track of conversations mid-sentence, the way I started at sudden noises that had never bothered me before. She would ask if I was feeling well, if work was more stressful than usual, if I was worried about something specific. Her questions were gentle but persistent, and each one felt like a test I was failing. I began to lie with an ease that frightened me. I invented concerns about suppliers and shipping delays, complained about customers who didn't exist, created elaborate explanations for my preoccupation that had nothing to do with the truth. The lies came so naturally that I sometimes caught myself believing them, as if my mind was desperately trying to create a version of reality that would explain my behavior without forcing me to confront what was really happening. But late at night, when the house was quiet and Elaine's breathing had settled into the rhythm of deep sleep, I would allow myself to imagine a different kind of life. Not the existence I had built around duty and expectation, but something tethered to truth, to desire, to the possibility of being known completely by another person. I would picture conversations with Malcolm that went beyond careful boundaries, touches that lasted longer than courtesy allowed, moments of honesty that might cost everything but would finally, let me breathe freely. These fantasies terrified me as much as they exhilarated me. To pursue them would mean dismantling everything I had spent decades constructing. It would mean disappointing people who trusted me, betraying commitments I had made in good faith, becoming someone I had never allowed myself to be. But it would also mean stopping the slow suffocation that had been killing me for years, the gradual erosion of my spirit that came from living in constant denial of my own heart. Malcolm seemed to understand this internal struggle without my having to explain it. He never demanded declarations or decisions, never pushed me toward choices I wasn't ready to make. Instead, he simply continued to be present, to create space for truth, to look at me with eyes that saw past the careful construction of my public self to whatever lived beneath. The most dangerous part was how right it felt, how natural, as if all the years of careful distance had been preparation for this slow, careful approach towards something real. When Malcolm spoke my name, when his hand steadied my shoulder, when his presence filled the space around me, I felt more like myself than I had in decades. And that feeling, more than anything else, was what made it impossible to turn back. The revelation came not in words, but in the profound silence that exists between one heartbeat and the next. It was a Tuesday evening in late October when Malcolm called and asked if I wanted to ride along on his evening patrol. He said there had been reports of suspicious activity near the county line, nothing serious, but he could use someone who knew the back roads as well as I did. I should have declined. Elaine was expecting me home for dinner, and I had promised to help her move some boxes to the attic. But when Malcolm asked, when his voice carried that particular quality that made refusal impossible, I found myself agreeing before my rational mind could intervene. I told Elaine I would be late, that the sheriff needed help with something that couldn't wait, and the ease with which the lie came out of my mouth should have warned me about how far I had already traveled from the man I used to be. Malcolm picked me up at the store just as the last light was fading from the sky. He looked tired in a way that went deeper than the usual exhaustion of a long day, and when I asked if everything was all right, he gave me a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He said he was fine, just needed to get out of town for a while, needed to remember what quiet felt like. We drove through the familiar streets of Hollow Creek and then beyond, onto the rural routes that connected our small world to the larger emptiness that surrounded it. The radio crackled occasionally with routine reports from dispatch, but Malcolm turned the volume down until the voices became a whisper barely audible above the hum of the engine. He drove with the same unhurried confidence he brought to everything, his hands steady on the wheel, his attention focused on the road ahead. But I could feel something different in the air between us, a tension that had nothing to do with the supposed suspicious activity we were investigating. When I asked about the reports that had prompted this patrol, Malcolm's answer was vague, noncommittal. He said someone had called about lights in the woods, maybe teenagers drinking or hunters checking their stands, probably nothing worth worrying about. We drove deeper into the countryside until the town disappeared completely behind us. until the only lights visible were the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky above. The roads grew narrower, more winding, bordered by fields that stretched into darkness beyond the reach of our headlights. This was the landscape of my childhood, roads I had traveled as a boy with my father when he made deliveries to rural customers. But tonight, everything felt unfamiliar, charged with possibility. Malcolm turned onto a dirt track I recognized as leading to an old hunting camp that had been abandoned years ago. The path was rutted and overgrown, forcing him to drive slowly, and with each mile we traveled away from civilization, I felt something loosening in my chest, some constraint I had carried for so long I had forgotten it was there. He parked in a clearing surrounded by tall pines, their silhouettes black against the star-filled sky. The silence that followed the shutting off of the engine was absolute, the kind of quiet that exists only in places where human activity is a distant memory. Malcolm made no move to get out of the car, and I understood that this wasn't really about investigating reports or checking on suspicious activity. This was about something else entirely. We sat in the darkness for several minutes, neither of us speaking, both of us aware that we had crossed some invisible boundary simply by coming here together. Through the windshield, I could see stars scattered across the sky with a clarity impossible in town, the Milky Way visible as a pale river of light stretching from horizon to horizon. The night felt vast and intimate at the same time, as if the entire universe had contracted to encompass just this moment, this place, this silence between us. When Malcolm finally moved, it was without ceremony or explanation. He simply reached across the seat and placed his hand over mine where it rested on my thigh. The contact was gentle but deliberate, his palm warm against my knuckles, his fingers curling slightly to hold my hand in place. I felt the warmth spread up my arm and through my chest, felt decades of careful control beginning to dissolve under the simple pressure of his touch. I didn't pull away. I couldn't have moved if I had wanted to. My entire body suddenly focused on the point where our skin made contact. I could feel his pulse through his fingertips, steady and strong, could feel the slight calluses on his palm that spoke of work done with his hands. This was not the casual touch of friendship or the professional contact of someone checking for injury. This was something else, something that acknowledged what had been building between us for months. We sat like that for what felt like hours, but might have been only minutes, his hand covering mine, while something fundamental shifted in the space between us. I could hear my own breathing, could feel my heart beating with a rhythm that seemed too loud in the absolute quiet of the clearing. When I finally found the courage to look at him, his eyes were already on my face, studying me with an intensity that made me feel transparent. Malcolm's other hand moved slowly, carefully, to touch the side of my face. His fingers traced the line of my jaw, rough with day-old stubble, and I felt myself leaning into his touch like a man who had been walking through a desert and had finally found water. The gesture was so tender, so patient, that it broke something open inside me that had been sealed for decades. When he leaned closer, when the space between us became smaller than a breath, I understood that he was offering rather than taking, asking a question rather than making a demand. Everything about the moment was a choice, an invitation I could accept or decline without judgment. But the careful distance I had maintained from my own truth for 47 years had finally become impossible to sustain. I met him halfway, closing the last inches between us with a movement that felt both inevitable and miraculous. The kiss was hesitant at first, tentative, both of us testing the reality of what was happening. His lips were warm and slightly chapped, tasting faintly of coffee and something indefinably him. When I felt him smile against my mouth, when his hand tightened slightly on mine, the hesitation dissolved into something deeper. This was not the careful, dutiful affection I had shared with Elaine for 26 years. This was something raw and honest and alive, something that reached into parts of me I had forgotten existed. When we finally separated, when the need for air forced us apart, I rested my forehead against his and whispered the only words that seemed adequate to the magnitude of what had just changed between us. I told him I had waited too long to acknowledge what I felt, too long to stop running from my own truth, too long to allow myself to be seen completely by another person. The words came out broken, barely audible, but they carried the weight of decades of denial, of careful performance, of living always at arm's length from my own heart. Malcolm's response was to pull me closer, to hold me against him with an embrace that felt like coming home after a lifetime of being lost. The world outside the car continued to exist, but it no longer seemed to matter. The stars continued their ancient dance across the sky, but time itself seemed to have stopped to accommodate this moment of perfect honesty between us. When we finally drove back toward town, neither of us spoke about what had happened or what it might mean for the carefully ordered lives we had built. But everything had changed, shifted so fundamentally that I felt like a different person inhabiting the same body. The road that carried us back to Hollow Creek was the same road we had traveled an hour before, but I was no longer the man who had made that journey. That version of myself had been left behind in the clearing, replaced by someone who could no longer pretend not to know what love felt like. The truth has a weight of its own, and secrets can only be carried for so long before they begin to reshape the person holding them. After that night in the clearing with Malcolm, I found it increasingly difficult to inhabit the familiar rhythms of my life with Elaine. Every gesture felt performative. Every conversation seemed to skate across the surface of something much deeper. I moved through our house like an actor who had forgotten his lines, trying to remember how to play the role of husband while my heart lived elsewhere. Elaine noticed, of course. 26 years of marriage had made her an expert in reading the subtle changes in my behavior, the small alterations in routine that signaled internal upheaval. She began watching me with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle, her eyes following my movements with a kind of quiet assessment that made my skin feel too tight. The way I reacted to Malcolm's name became a particular source of scrutiny. When she mentioned seeing him at the grocery store or hearing about some incident he had handled, I would feel my entire body tense involuntarily. My shoulders would stiffen, my hands would still whatever task they were performing, and something would shift in my expression that I couldn't quite control. These reactions lasted only seconds, but they were enough to register in Elaine's careful observation of my behavior. She started mentioning Malcolm more frequently, as if testing my responses, watching for the involuntary flinch that seemed to accompany any reference to the sheriff. When she asked if I had spoken to him lately, when she wondered aloud whether we should invite him for dinner since he spent so much time alone, when she mentioned that he had seemed tired the last time she saw him, I could feel myself failing each small test. The confrontation, when it finally came, happened on a Thursday evening in early November. I was sitting at the kitchen table, ostensibly reading the local newspaper, but actually reliving every moment of my last conversation with Malcolm, when Elaine joined me with a cup of tea. She didn't speak immediately, just sat across from me in the chair she had occupied for thousands of meals, her hands wrapped around the warm ceramic as if drawing comfort from its heat. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear her. She said my name, not the casual way she usually addressed me, but with the careful pronunciation of someone who wanted to ensure they had my complete attention. I looked up from the newspaper I hadn't been reading, and the expression on her face told me that whatever was coming would change everything between us. She didn't accuse me of anything specific. She didn't demand explanations or threaten consequences. Instead, she simply observed that I had become someone she didn't recognize, that the man sitting across from her bore only superficial resemblance to the person she had married. She said this not with anger but with a kind of resigned sadness, as if she had been watching me disappear gradually and had finally accepted the reality of my absence. Then she asked the question that cut through every careful lie I had constructed, every rationalization I had built to protect myself from the truth of what was happening. She asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, if I loved him. Not whether I was having an affair, not whether I had been unfaithful, just whether love was the force that had been reshaping me from the inside out. The question hung in the air between us like smoke, visible and toxic and impossible to ignore. I opened my mouth to deny it, to manufacture some explanation that would preserve the fiction we had been living, but the words wouldn't come. Looking into Elaine's eyes, seeing the quiet certainty there, I realized that lying would be not just futile but cruel. She already knew the answer. She was simply giving me the opportunity to admit what we both understood to be true. My silence became its own confession. I watched something die in her expression, some last hope that she had been wrong about what she was seeing. But there was also relief there, the release that comes with finally naming something that has been causing pain for months. We sat in that silence for several minutes, both of us processing the implications of what had just been acknowledged without being spoken. The weight of the choice settled over me like a heavy coat I couldn't remove. To remain in this marriage would mean continuing to live the life that was expected of me, maintaining the careful construction of respectability I had built over decades. It would mean safety, predictability, the approval of everyone who mattered in Hollow Creek. But it would also mean continuing to suffocate slowly, to live always at a distance from my own truth. To step toward Malcolm would mean risking everything I had built, everything I was supposed to be. My reputation, my marriage, my standing in the community, my daughter's respect, my own understanding of who I was supposed to be in this world. But it would also mean finally living honestly, finally allowing myself to be known completely by another person, finally breathing freely after decades of careful suffocation. I met Malcolm at the clearing 3 nights later, driving there after telling Elaine I needed to check on something at the store. The lie came easily now, too easily, and I hated myself for how naturally deception had become part of my daily routine. But I also knew that this conversation with Malcolm couldn't happen anywhere else, couldn't risk being overheard or interrupted by the ordinary business of small-town life. He was waiting for me when I arrived, leaning against his truck with his arms crossed, looking up at the stars with the same steady patience he brought to everything. When I approached him, when I tried to find words adequate to explain the chaos that had been consuming me since my conversation with Elaine, my voice broke before I could complete a single sentence. I told him about the confrontation, about the question Elaine had asked, and the answer I couldn't give but couldn't deny. I admitted my fear, the terror that came with imagining what would happen if I chose truth over safety. I confessed the guilt that was eating me alive, the knowledge that pursuing what I wanted would inevitably cause pain to someone who had never deserved it. But I also told him about the longing that had been killing me slowly for months, the desperate need to stop pretending to be someone I wasn't, the exhaustion that came with living always in careful performance of a role that no longer fit. My words came out broken and disjointed, but Malcolm listened with the same intense attention he had always given me, never interrupting, never judging, simply witnessing my struggle with the kind of presence that made honesty possible. When I finally ran out of words, when the confession had emptied me of everything except the raw need for his response, Malcolm stepped closer and placed his hands on my shoulders. He looked directly into my eyes and said something that both relieved and terrified me in equal measure. He told me I didn't have to choose tonight, that these decisions couldn't be rushed or forced, but that eventually I would have to choose. The moment hung between us like a held breath, heavy with implication and possibility. I looked down at my own hands, remembering suddenly that first evening when Malcolm had told me to put my hands somewhere, to stay still for just a moment. At the time, those words had seemed inexplicable, but now I understood them differently. He hadn't been trying to control me or demonstrate his authority. He had been asking me to be present, to ground myself in the reality of the moment instead of floating away into the careful distance I maintained from everything that mattered. Those hands he had asked me to place on his car door weren't symbols of submission, but anchors to truth, to the possibility of being seen and known completely. Standing there in the clearing, feeling the weight of the choice I would eventually have to make, I realized that all these months of careful approach had been leading to this moment of recognition. Not just of what I felt for Malcolm, but of what it would mean to finally stop hiding from my own life, to finally live as someone who was present and alive and unhidden, whatever the cost might be. The resolution came not with declarations or dramatic gestures, but with the quiet accumulation of small truths finally acknowledged. It arrived in images that would stay with me long after the words stopped mattering, moments that crystallized everything that had been building between all of us for months. I remember the morning I found Elaine sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold hours before. Her wedding ring rested beside the cup, a small circle of gold catching the early light that filtered through the curtains. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. She simply sat there looking out the window at our carefully maintained yard, at the life we had built together with such methodical precision, and I understood that she had made her own peace with what was happening. When she noticed me standing in the doorway, she didn't look away from the window. She just said, in a voice that carried no accusation, that she had known for weeks. Not suspected, not wondered, but known with the certainty that comes from loving someone long enough to recognize when they have become someone else entirely. She said it without bitterness, as if she were simply reporting the weather or commenting on the neighbor's new fence. She told me she didn't hate me for what I couldn't help being. She said she was tired of pretending that either of us was happy, tired of the careful choreography we had perfected to avoid acknowledging the emptiness that lived at the center of our marriage. The relief in her voice was unmistakable, the sound of someone finally allowed to stop carrying a weight that had been crushing her slowly for years. We didn't discuss lawyers or division of property or how to explain things to our daughter. Those conversations would come later, handled with the same quiet dignity that Elaine brought to everything. Instead, we simply sat together in the kitchen where we had shared thousands of meals, both of us finally free to acknowledge what we had been pretending not to see. That evening, I found myself in Malcolm's truck on a back road that stretched into darkness, the familiar landscape of my childhood rendered strange and new by the weight of what had changed. We weren't patrolling or investigating or responding to any call. We were simply driving, letting the movement carry us away from the complicated business of explanations and consequences and into the vast simplicity of empty roads and star-filled sky. Malcolm drove with his usual unhurried confidence, but there was something different in the quality of his attention. He wasn't watching for problems or scanning for potential trouble. He was simply present, anchored to this moment in a way that seemed to slow time itself. When he pulled over at the same clearing where everything had begun, neither of us spoke about why we had come here or what we hoped to find. We sat in the darkness with the engine off, surrounded by the absolute quiet that exists only in places where human activity is a distant memory. Through the windshield, I could see the same stars that had witnessed our first honest conversation, but tonight they seemed closer somehow, as if the entire universe had contracted to encompass just this truck, just this silence, just the space between us that no longer felt charged with uncertainty. When Malcolm reached across the seat and placed his hand over mine, I didn't startle or tense or fight the urge to pull away. This time, I simply let myself feel the warmth of his palm against my knuckles, the steady pressure that seemed to anchor me not just to this moment, but to myself. For the first time in months, I wasn't trembling. My hands were still, my breathing was steady, my heart was beating with a rhythm that felt sustainable rather than desperate. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't empty. It was full of possibility, of the future we might build together, of the courage it would take to live honestly in a place where honesty carried a price. Malcolm's thumb traced small circles against my hand, and I understood that he wasn't asking for promises or commitments or guarantees about what would happen next. He was simply offering presence, the gift of being completely seen without judgment. I closed my eyes and took what felt like the first real breath I had drawn in years. The air filled my lungs completely, reaching places that had been closed off for so long I had forgotten they existed. When I exhaled, something loosened in my chest, some constriction that had been slowly suffocating me for decades. I breathed again, deeper this time, and felt my entire body remember what it meant to be alive rather than simply surviving. When I opened my eyes, Malcolm was watching me with an expression I had never seen before. Not the careful evaluation of our early conversations, not the patient waiting that had characterized so much of our time together, but something simpler and more profound. He was looking at me with recognition, seeing not the careful construction I had presented to the world for 47 years, but the person I had always been underneath. The night stretched wide and uncertain before us, filled with questions we couldn't answer and challenges we couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time since this all began, I wasn't afraid of what the dawn might bring. Whatever happened next, whatever price we would have to pay for choosing truth over comfort, I would face it as someone who was finally, completely, unhidden. The resolution wasn't dramatic or final. It was simply a breath, a moment of perfect stillness, a hand covering mine in the darkness while the stars continued their ancient dance overhead. It was the quiet recognition that some truths are worth any cost, and that love, when it finally arrives, makes even the most careful life feel like a preparation for living.